If we're using CO2 enrichment, which is what you're going to want to do to increase your yield and quality, VPD becomes extremely important. Hey everybody, it's Eric again with Cultivate, cultivatecolorado.com, here today to talk to you about my 6 best tips for the beginner grower, okay? These tips are gonna help you avoid some of the complications that a lot of growers face when they are attempting to do their first run. A lot of people think that you could just throw a seed in soil and that the plant will just grow itself, but unfortunately, if you want quality product and you want quality yield, you're gonna have to put a little bit more effort in than that. So the first thing that I would recommend, and the first thing that I would like to talk about, is people's tendencies to overcomplicate things, okay? I highly recommend that, especially in the beginning, you keep things simple and don't get overwhelmed with so much of the information that is available to us these days. There's lots of videos on YouTube, lots of podcasts and blogs, all these kind of things. But don't forget that it's just a plant. Plants need water, they need food, they need light. These are the things that are most important, okay?
Keep it simple, stupid. Great advice. Hurts my feelings every time.
If you have proper equipment, meaning you have good lights, and these days that's going to mean an LED, especially in a smaller grow situation. If you have proper environment, meaning that the temperature and your humidity is good, and that you're using a good nutrient line, you're going to have a quality product, and it's going to yield well. First thing I'd like to talk about is your space, okay? So when you are looking at your space and you're looking at your total square footage, this is gonna determine A, how much light you wanna use, B, how many plants you wanna use, so your plant volume, and C, what your HVAC requirements are gonna be to keep that environment where you want it to be. So for instance, if I have a 4x4 space, so that's 16 square feet. That is gonna require typically, and classically you would use a 1,000-watt high pressure sodium light to light a 4x4 space. These days, people are moving towards, and the industry itself is moving towards LED lighting because it's way more efficient, produces way more light relative to how much heat it produces. So typically for a 4x4 space, we're going to use these days a 650 to a 720 watt LED. So if you have 8x8 space, 64 square feet, you're going to need 4 of those lights to provide a quality PAR, which is photosynthetically available radiation, to your canopy, okay? So the next thing that we need to assess with our space is going to be plant volume. So there's several ways to skin a cat here, right? So you could do less plants. Let's say plant count is of concern to you, or you don't have access to enough clones or cuts or seeds, whatever it may be, however you're choosing to grow, to get the amount of plants that you want. You could do larger plants for a specific space. So for instance, if I want to do 2 plants for a 4x4 footprint, I could do those in 10-gallon pots and grow larger plants with a longer veg period and fill that canopy out. Or I could do several smaller plants. So I could do 12 plants, for instance, in 1-gallon pots with a much shorter veg time to fill the same amount of space.
If you can dream it, you can do it.
So these are things you're gonna have to determine yourself. And I know that this is getting on the border of being complicated, and I know I spoke about keeping things simple, but these are just some things to think about when you're deciding how to build your room out and how many plants you're going to put into your space. Now, coming in at number 3, we're gonna talk about environment. Now, after light and HVAC, your environment is the most important thing. So this means maintaining proper temperature, proper humidity, and if you want to use CO2 enrichment, which is going to increase photosynthesis of your plants and therefore increase the yield and quality of your plants, you're going to have these things under control.
Photosynthesis.
So ideally, when we are growing, and this becomes easier with LED lights because they create less total heat and they don't irradiate heat. So they don't create any IR, infrared spectrum. The heat that they do create is just kind of energizing the air. So the temperature at the canopy of your plants is going to be the same as the temperature in your room. Whereas if you're using high intensity discharge plants, i.e. high pressure sodium or metal halide, the temperature at your canopy is always going to be hotter than the ambient temperature of the room because those bulbs are producing an extraordinarily high amount of infrared radiation, which is going to create more surface heat at the area where the light is being produced. So Ideally, we want our temperature to be about 82 degrees with the lights on and 72 to 75 when the lights are off, okay? If you have too high of a temperature when the lights are off, the plants are gonna become rigid and they're not gonna be as bendable and stretchable and trainable. We wanna be able to train our plants and manipulate them to fill the most amount of canopy space. And if your temperatures, while the lights are on, are 82, let's say, and then your temperatures with the lights off are 80, then the plants are not going to transpirate properly and they're not gonna be as healthy as they otherwise would.
Too damn hot.
Then we're gonna talk about VPD. VPD stands for vapor pressure deficit. Vapor pressure deficit is the relative temperature to the humidity. So your VPD, if at 82 degrees, if you have your humidity at 60, you're gonna have a vapor pressure deficit of 1. This is ideal for most of the process. If you want to get a little bit more advanced, you can adjust the VPD over the course of your flowering cycle, but to keep it simple, we want about a 1.0 vapor pressure deficit, and you can find charts for this all over the internet. If we're using CO2 enrichment, which is what you're gonna wanna do to increase your yield and quality, VPD becomes extremely important because the vapor pressure deficit is what allows the stomata of your leaves, which are essentially like the pores on your skin. Leaves also have pores. These are called stomata. If those are not open, then the plant cannot breathe in the CO2 that is required to perform photosynthesis, and therefore enriching your environment with CO2 becomes extremely less effective, okay?
It's important.
So we want to make sure, especially if we're going to be enriching our environment with CO2, that we have a very good vapor pressure deficit and that we keep it consistent and steady. All right, before we move on to topic number 4, if you found any of this information useful or helpful thus far, don't forget to drop a like and a subscribe, okay guys? Appreciate it. So, number 4, choosing your nutrient line. So there's essentially 3 types of nutrients. You have liquid nutrients, you have powdered or salts, and then you have organic nutrients, which is gonna be organic matter that needs to be broken down in your soil to be available to your plants. So, starting with liquid nutrients. Liquid nutrients are gonna be the most easy to use with the most forgiveness and the most margin for error, okay? So let's say you misdose something when you're using a product like Canna or Advanced Nutrients or House and Garden, you're gonna have a little bit more forgiveness from your plants than you would if you were using salt nutrients, okay? So don't forget, all of the synthetic nutrients that are not organic are utilizing salts, but the liquids are gonna have some organic buffers in them that are gonna help with uptake and help to avoid lockout, okay? The powdered nutrients, or salts as they're most commonly called these days, i.e. Athena, Front Row, things like that, those are gonna be really, really great, cheaper, and equally as effective, but they're gonna have less of a margin for error, more opportunity to lock your plants out. And when you have lockout, it's really hard to remedy. So for the beginner, I definitely suggest some kind of liquid nutrient. And then lastly, we have organics, okay? Some people are really all about the organics, and it is gonna provide a specific quality of flavor and look that you're not gonna get from synthetic nutrients, and it is very easy to do for the beginner. It can be expensive, and it's not gonna result in as vigorous a growth or as quick a growth and as much yield. But the quality is exceptional and really, really very easy. So that's gonna come to our next topic, number 5, which is choosing your medium. Now, choosing your medium is gonna be really contingent on the type of nutrient that you wanna use. If you're using organic nutrients, you're not gonna be able to use organic nutrients in something like pure cocoa or rock wool. You're gonna want to use an organic medium that has soil that has other organic components in it, like bat guano and worm castings, things like that. And you're also gonna need to provide the plant with root acceleration and things like that so that the organic matter could be broken down and made available to the plant and to the root zone, okay? So powdered nutrients, synthetic liquid nutrients, these are already immediately bioavailable to the plant, whereas organic nutrients need to be broken down in the rhizosphere to be available to the plant, okay?
English, Doc.
So typically these days, what you'll see the most is gonna be a cocoa medium for synthetic nutrients, and that's gonna include liquid and powder nutrients, or rock wool. Rock wool I do not recommend for the beginner, A, because they dry out much more quickly than other mediums, so if you miss a watering, the plants are more likely to die. Now, rock wool provides the most vigorous growth, but if you don't have a drip feed and some kind of automated irrigation, it's almost impossible to do. So what I recommend for the beginner grower, and that's what this video is about, my tips for the beginner grower, I recommend a cocoa or cocoa mix. So like cocoa with perlite, or a mix of like cocoa and pro mix, which is just like peat and perlite, or even just pro mix, which is gonna be peat moss and perlite, which is really, really easy to use. And it's gonna retain moisture for longer than cocoa. So if you're using large pots with something like pro mix, you can water less often and have less concern about your plants drying out too quickly or drying out too much, and then having drought scenarios where you're really, really stressing the plants. We want to avoid that at all costs.
At all costs.
So for the beginner grower, I recommend that you use something like Pro Mix or cocoa. If you want to use synthetic nutrients, or something with organic components in it, in the soil, if you're going to do organic nutrients, okay? All right, guys, coming in number 6, we're going to talk about knowing your strain. And so this is going to tie into a lot of the things that we've covered already. So you're going to have some strains that have a photo period, and by photo period, I mean the length of time of flowering, which is how long it's going to take to produce buds and bring them to full term. So you're going to have some that have, let's say, a 7-week photo period, and some that have 9 to 10 weeks, okay? And this is going to affect your space, right? So we talked about knowing your space. You're gonna have some plants that if you have a 7-week photo period, these tend to be shorter and they're gonna stretch less. When you switch your lighting from your 18 hours of light to your 12 hours of light to change and flip into flowering, it's gonna cause your plants to stretch, okay? Some plants stretch a lot, some plants stretch a little. And you need to know this because if you have a lower ceiling height, let's say if you're in a tent or in a smaller space, you need to know that if a plant stretches a lot, that you need to change those lights earlier on in the cycle so that they don't grow into your light. We never want the plant to be closer than 6 inches to the light if you're using LEDs. If you're using HID lighting, you need it significantly further. So knowing your equipment and knowing your strain, knowing your space, knowing your strain, and even knowing your nutrients and knowing your strain are all gonna tie together, because depending on what strain you're using, it's gonna have different food requirements, it's gonna have different lighting requirements, and it's gonna have different space requirements. So just keep all these things in mind. It's super important to know when you are selecting a strain based on the space and the equipment that you have available to you. Now, just so you know, the most important things at the end of the day are gonna be having quality equipment that you can get right here from us at Cultivate Colorado, and having proper nutrients, proper feeding regimens, and having helpful insight from people that really know what they're doing. And that's something that we can provide here for you. We have all that, we have knowledgeable staff, and we can answer any questions that you have regarding all of the topics that we've covered here. All right, guys, that wraps up my top 6 points for beginners. If you found this stuff useful, don't forget, again, to drop a like or subscribe. If you have anything to add, if you have any questions, if you have any ideas about what we can add to help you guys out, feel free to leave a comment below or to give us a call, send an email, come into the store. We'd be happy to talk to you guys and figure it all out together, okay, guys? We'll see you again next time.